Sergeant First Class Holt's voice cut across the staging area like a blade. "Sir, I need you to step back behind the barrier immediately. This area is for ceremony participants only." The old man in the faded green uniform did not move. His hands, spotted with age and trembling slightly, remained folded in front of him with a stillness that seemed practiced over decades. What Holt did not know, what no one on that security detail could have known, was that the ceremony happening in exactly 47 minutes existed because of the man he was trying to remove. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's parade ground, where crews had been working since before dawn to prepare for the presidential visit. White chairs stood in precise rows facing an elevated platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Secret Service agents moved through the perimeter with earpieces and dark glasses, their presence transforming the familiar base into something charged with importance. And standing just inside the VIP staging area, conspicuously out of place among the modern Army service uniforms surrounding him, stood Ezra Whitmore. His uniform was Army green, the style phased out decades ago, its fabric faded to something closer to sage than the deep forest it had once been. The buttons had lost their shine somewhere around 1985. The ribbons on his chest were arranged in a configuration that would have made any modern soldier squint with confusion. Awards and decorations organized according to regulations that no longer existed. His shoes, once glossy black, now bore the permanent scuff marks of too many years and not enough polish. He looked, to anyone giving him a passing glance, like a man who had wandered in from a Veterans Day parade that ended 30 years ago. Holt approached with the theatrical authority of a man who understood that a presidential visit meant everything had to be perfect. His boots struck the pavement with deliberate weight. His voice carried far enough for the nearby personnel to hear, establishing his command of the situation for any witnesses who might be watching. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. This area is restricted." Holt gestured broadly toward the barriers 50 meters back, where civilian guests were being processed through security. "You need to return to the public viewing area and wait like everyone else." The old man's eyes, pale blue and watery with age, lifted slowly to meet the sergeant's gaze. His voice came out soft, almost apologetic, roughened by years of disuse. "I understand your concern, Sergeant. I truly do. But I have business here today. Business I have waited a very long time to complete." Holt felt his jaw tighten. He had dealt with confused, elderly veterans before, men who showed up to events believing their service entitled them to access that protocol simply did not allow. Most of them meant well. Most of them could be redirected with firm but respectful guidance. But this one, something about the way he stood there, unmoved, as if Holt's authority meant nothing at all, struck a nerve that the sergeant could not quite name. "Business." Holt let the word hang between them with obvious contempt. "Sir, the only business happening here today is a Medal of Honor ceremony for the President of the United States. Unless you have credentials indicating you belong on this platform, your business is behind those barriers with the general public." The old man's hand moved slowly to his breast pocket, where the corner of something yellowed and worn was barely visible. His fingers touched it but did not remove it, as if drawing comfort from its presence. "I knew the man being honored today," he said quietly. "I made him a promise. A long time ago." Holt's eyes dropped to the uniform, scanning the ribbons with the quick assessment of someone who had spent enough time around awards to recognize when something looked wrong. His gaze snagged on a small rectangular ribbon near the top of the arrangement, its colors unfamiliar, its placement suggesting a precedence that made no sense according to any regulation Holt had ever studied. What is that supposed to be? Holt pointed at the ribbon without asking permission, his fingers stopping inches from the old man's chest. "I have never seen that ribbon in my life. And the way you have these arranged, that is not even close to proper order of precedence." The old man looked down at his own chest, as if seeing the ribbons for the first time in years. "These were arranged according to the regulations in place when I last wore this uniform, Sergeant. I have not updated them since." "When you last wore it?" Holt's voice rose with incredulity. "Sir, this uniform style was discontinued before I was born." You expect me to believe you just pulled it out of a closet and decided to wear it to a presidential ceremony? The old man's response came without defensiveness, without heat, delivered in the same quiet tone he had used from the beginning. I wore this uniform the day I buried my team, Sergeant. I have not worn it since. Until today. Something flickered across Holt's face, a momentary crack in his certainty, but it sealed itself almost immediately. He had heard stories before. Every old man at every ceremony had a story. Most of them were exaggerated. Some of them were outright fabricated. And the ones that turned out to be true rarely belonged to men who looked like this. Men whose uniforms no longer fit properly around shoulders that had narrowed with age. Men whose hands shook when they reached for their pockets. Sir, I'm going to be direct with you. Holt crossed his arms over his chest, his posture broadcasting the dismissal his words were about to deliver. We get people every year who show up to these events wearing uniforms they bought online, claiming service they never rendered. Stolen valor is a federal offense. And frankly, looking at you right now, looking at that costume you're wearing, I have serious doubts about whether any of what you're claiming is real. The word landed in the space between them. Costume. The old man's hands, still folded in front of him, did not clench. His expression did not harden. But something shifted in his posture, something subtle, a slight straightening of the spine that seemed to subtract years from his frame in the span of a single breath. When he spoke, his voice remained soft, but beneath the softness there was something else now, something that sounded almost like patience worn down to its final thread. I understand your suspicion, Sergeant. You see an old man in an old uniform making claims you cannot verify. You're doing your job. But I would ask you to consider that some things are not meant to be verified through normal channels. Some things were never meant to be spoken about at all, until they were. Holt opened his mouth to respond, but a movement at the edge of his vision made him pause. A Navy commander in dress whites had stopped about 20 meters away, her attention fixed on the confrontation with an intensity that made Holt suddenly aware of how many people might be watching. Behind her, a cluster of junior enlisted personnel had slowed their preparations, their eyes darting between the sergeant and the old man with expressions that ranged from curiosity to discomfort. Sir, Holt lowered his voice, attempting to regain control of the situation through a shift to something resembling reasonableness. I'm going to give you one more chance to relocate yourself to the public area voluntarily. If you refuse, I will be forced to call for military police escort, and this will become a much more unpleasant situation for everyone involved. The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this outcome. He looked past Holt toward the platform where, in less than an hour, a ceremony would take place that had been 53 years in the making. His hand touched the photograph in his breast pocket again, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the parade ground, something that existed only in memory. I have waited 53 years to keep a promise, Sergeant. I can wait through whatever you decide to do to me next. Holt reached for his radio, thumb finding the transmit button with practiced ease. But 30 meters away, the Navy commander had pulled out her phone, and her hands were trembling as she aimed it at the old man's chest. Because she had finally seen what Holt had not. The ribbon he did not recognize. The arrangement that made no sense. And beneath the old man's sleeve, where the fabric had shifted as he reached for his photograph, a glimpse of faded ink on weathered skin. Coordinates, a date, and names. Names she had seen before in a classified briefing, in a room where they taught officers about missions that officially never happened. The photograph had lived against his heart for 53 years. Two faces stared back from the faded image, both young, both unaware of what the next 72 hours would cost them. Ezra's thumb traced the edge of the photograph as it had done 10,000 times before, finding the crease where Isaiah's smile met the jungle backdrop, finding the smudge where rain had blurred the corner during the long march home. Isaiah Okonkwo had been 22 years old when that photograph was taken. He had been the youngest man on the team by nearly 4 years, a radio operator from the south side of Chicago who had volunteered for Special Forces because, as he put it, regular Army did not seem like enough of a challenge. He had a laugh that could cut through the worst nights in the jungle, a talent for finding something to be grateful for when everyone else had forgotten what gratitude felt like. He had been the one who kept them human when everything around them was trying to make them into something else. The memory unfolded behind Ezra's eyes like a door opening onto a room he had never been able to close. Laos, 1968. A mission that would never appear in any official record. Reconnaissance for an operation that would later be known as Ivory Coast. They had been inserted by helicopter into terrain so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground, tasked with gathering intelligence on a prisoner of war camp that the enemy did not want anyone to know existed. 5 men. Ezra leading. Isaiah on the radio. Marcus Tran on point. William Coldwater handling demolitions. Derek Yazzie watching their backs. 5 men who trusted each other with everything, because out there, in the places that did not exist on any map, trust was the only currency that mattered. The ambush came on the 3rd day. They had been careful. They had followed every protocol, checked every approach, trusted their training and their instincts. But the enemy had been more careful. The first burst of gunfire took Marcus in the throat before anyone could react. The second burst caught Derek in the spine as he turned to return fire. William went down trying to drag Derek to cover, a round passing through his helmet and ending everything he had ever been or would ever be. Ezra remembered the sounds more than the sights. The crack of automatic weapons echoing off trees. The wet thud of rounds finding flesh. Isaiah's voice on the radio, calling for extraction that could not come fast enough, his words steady even as the world collapsed around them. And then the sound that would follow Ezra through every night for the next 5 decades. The soft grunt of impact as Isaiah stepped between Ezra and the muzzle flash that had been meant for him. The rounds had torn through Isaiah's side, missing his vest by inches, shredding tissue and severing the artery that would empty his life onto the jungle floor in less than 2 minutes. Ezra had caught him as he fell, had pressed his hands against wounds that no amount of pressure could seal, had watched the light in those young eyes begin to flicker like a candle in a wind that would not stop blowing. Isaiah's voice had been barely a whisper by then, his lips forming words that took everything he had left to speak. Not your fault, Spectre. Never your fault. You get home. You tell my mama I did good. You tell her I was not afraid. Ezra had carried him. 12 miles through enemy territory, through jungle so thick that every step was a negotiation with vines and roots and mud that wanted to swallow them both. Isaiah had died somewhere around mile 3, his body going slack against Ezra's back, his blood soaking through Ezra's uniform until it felt like a second skin. But Ezra had not stopped. He could not stop, because leaving Isaiah behind would have meant leaving behind every promise he had ever made about bringing his men home. The extraction point had been chaos. Helicopter blades cutting through air thick with smoke and gunfire. Hands reaching down to pull Ezra aboard, then pausing when they realized the man on his back was no longer breathing. The medic's voice, clinical and distant. "He is gone, Sergeant. There is nothing we can do." And Ezra's response, the words ripping out of him like something torn from the deepest part of his chest. "I know, but I was not going to leave him there. I was not going to let him die alone." If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below with your city or country. And if stories about promises kept and heroes remembered speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that honor those who have been waiting too long to be seen. Now, let us continue. The debriefing had lasted for 6 hours. Men in uniforms without insignia asking questions about terrain and enemy positions and intelligence gathered, never once asking about the 4 men whose bodies had been loaded onto separate helicopters, never once acknowledging that anything had been lost beyond operational assets. The mission was classified before the helicopter touched down. The deaths were recorded as training accidents. The families received flags and condolences and lies about where their sons had actually fallen. Ezra had gone to see Isaiah's mother 3 weeks later. Lucille Okonkwo lived in a small apartment on the south side, surrounded by photographs of a son who would never grow old. She had known, Somehow, the moment she opened the door and saw Ezra standing there in his dress uniform, she had known that he was not there to deliver good news, because good news did not arrive wearing that expression, carrying that weight in its shoulders. He had told her what he could, which was almost nothing. He had told her that Isaiah had been brave, that Isaiah had saved lives, that Isaiah had not been afraid at the end. He had not told her that Isaiah had taken rounds meant for him. He had not told her that her son's blood still appeared in his dreams, warm and endless, soaking through everything he tried to build over the empty spaces left behind. Lucille had taken his hands in hers, her grip stronger than he expected, her eyes holding something that looked almost like forgiveness. "You were with him," she had said. "At the end. You were with my boy." "Yes, ma'am. I was with him." "Then you did enough. You did more than enough." But Ezra had made a promise that day, standing in that small apartment, surrounded by photographs of a young man who deserved to be remembered by more than just his mother. "When they tell the truth about what we did out there," he had told her, "when they finally let the world know what Isaiah sacrificed, I will be there. I will stand up and make sure everyone knows he was not forgotten." Lucille had smiled at him then, a smile that carried 50 years of understanding about how the world worked and how long it took for truth to find its way into the light. "I believe you," she had said, "and I will hold you to that promise, young man, however long it takes." It had taken 53 years. Lucille had died 3 years ago, her final words to Ezra a reminder that echoed through every day since. "You have punished yourself long enough. When they tell the truth, you stand up. You let them see you." The notification had arrived 6 months ago. Declassification review complete. Posthumous Medal of Honor approved for Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo. Ceremony to be held at Fort Bragg, attended by the President of the United States. Ezra had read the letter 7 times before he believed it was real. He had visited Isaiah's grave that same afternoon, pressing the notification against the headstone as if Isaiah could somehow read it through the granite. "They are finally telling the truth, brother. They are finally letting the world see what you did." And now he stood on the parade ground where Isaiah had trained 54 years ago, wearing the uniform he had last worn the day he buried his team, facing a sergeant who saw nothing but a confused old man in outdated clothes. Ezra's hand pressed the photograph closer to his heart. He had waited 53 years to keep this promise. He could wait through whatever came next. Holt returned with 2 military police officers flanking him like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence he had already decided to deliver. The MPs were young, barely into their 20s, their faces holding the careful blankness of men who had been told to follow orders without asking questions. Their hands rested near their belts, not on their weapons, but close enough to make the threat implicit. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one final time to produce credentials authorizing your presence in this area." Holt's voice had grown louder now, pitched to carry across the staging area where more personnel had stopped their preparations to watch. "If you cannot produce valid documentation, these officers will escort you to the Security Processing Center where we can verify your identity and determine whether charges are appropriate." Ezra's hand moved slowly to his breast pocket, and for a moment Holt tensed, the MPs shifting their weight in response. But what emerged was not a weapon. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its creases worn soft from decades of handling. Ezra unfolded it with the care of a man handling something sacred and held it out for Holt to examine. "This is the notification I received in 1968, Ezra said quietly, "informing me of Corporal Okonkwo's death. I am listed as the next of kin contact because Isaiah had no family except his mother, and she was not able to receive official military correspondence at her address. I have carried this letter for 53 years. Holt took the paper with obvious skepticism, his eyes scanning the faded typeface. The official letterhead from an Army office that no longer existed, the signature of a commanding officer whose name meant nothing to him. His lip curled slightly as he handed it back. "This proves nothing." Holt's dismissal was theatrical, performed for the audience that had gathered. Anyone could have found this at an estate sale, picked it up at an auction, pulled it from a relative's belongings. You expect me to believe you've been carrying around a 50-year-old letter, just waiting for this moment? I expect nothing, Sergeant. Ezra folded the letter and returned it to his pocket with the same deliberate care. I'm simply showing you what I have. What you have is a piece of paper and a story. Holt stepped closer, close enough that Ezra could smell the coffee on his breath, the sharp scent of aftershave applied with a heavy hand. What I have is a security protocol for a presidential visit that does not include accommodating every old man who wanders in claiming to know somebody. The words hung in the air between them. Behind Holt, the Navy commander had moved closer, her phone no longer recording, but her attention fixed on the confrontation with an intensity that made several of the junior enlisted personnel exchange uncertain glances. A young private, barely 19 with red hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, had stopped arranging chairs and was watching Ezra with an expression that looked almost like recognition, though she could not have said what she was recognizing. Holt's finger jabbed toward the ribbons on Ezra's chest. And another thing, I have been looking at your decorations, and half of them do not even exist. This one here. He pointed at the unfamiliar rectangular ribbon near the top of the arrangement. There is no such award in any database I have ever seen. You want to explain to me how you are wearing a ribbon for a medal that was never created? Ezra looked down at the ribbon in question. His voice, when he answered, carried a weight that seemed to press against the air itself. That ribbon was created, Sergeant. It simply was never meant to be seen. There were operations conducted during the war that required recognition but could not be acknowledged publicly. Those of us who participated received awards that existed only in classified files. When those files were sealed, the awards ceased to exist in any official capacity. But we were still allowed to wear them. We simply could not explain what they were for. Holt's laugh was sharp and short. So you're telling me you have secret medals for secret missions that nobody can verify because the records are classified? He turned to the MPs with an expression of exaggerated disbelief. You hear this? We have got ourselves a real-life James Bond over here. One of the MPs, the younger one with a fresh haircut and uncertain eyes, did not laugh. He was looking at the way Ezra stood, the way his weight distributed despite the obvious limp, the way his hands remained perfectly still even as Holt's aggression escalated. Something about that stillness was troubling him in a way he could not articulate. Sir, Holt's patience had reached its visible end. I am done playing games. You're going to come with these officers right now, or I'm going to add resisting security personnel to whatever charges end up being filed. Your choice. He reached for Ezra's arm, his grip closing around the bicep with more force than necessary, fingers digging into the faded fabric of the old uniform. The motion pushed Ezra's sleeve up toward his elbow, and the morning sunlight fell across skin that had been hidden beneath the fabric. The tattoo was faded but still legible. Numbers first, coordinates rendered in precise military notation. Below them, a date, March 15th, 1968. And beneath that, arranged in a careful column for names. Marcus Tran, William Coldwater, Derek Yazzie, Isaiah Okonkwo. The ink had blurred with age, but each letter remained distinct, permanently etched into flesh that had carried them for over half a century. Holt's grip loosened slightly, his eyes catching the tattoo without fully registering what he was seeing. The Navy commander, however, had moved close enough to see clearly. Her face had gone pale, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a nearby chair. She had seen those coordinates before. She had studied them in a classified briefing at Naval Intelligence Headquarters, in a room where they taught officers about operations that officially never happened. Operations with code names that were still redacted in documents released to the public. Operations that had sent men into countries where American forces were never supposed to be. The young private with the red hair had seen the tattoo too. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, had come home with similar ink on his forearm, coordinates and names that he never explained before he died. She did not know what Ezra's tattoo meant, but she knew what it looked like. It looked like grief made permanent. It looked like a memorial that could never be removed. Holt released Ezra's arm and stepped back, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been doubt. But the doubt lasted only a moment before his expression hardened again. Coordinates and names. Holt's voice dripped with renewed contempt. Let me guess. You got that tattoo at some veteran convention to make yourself look authentic. Maybe paid $50 at a parlor that specializes in this kind of thing. Ezra pulled his sleeve back down slowly, covering the names that had lived against his skin for longer than Holt had been alive. His voice remained steady, but beneath the steadiness there was something that sounded almost like exhaustion. These names are men who died under my command, Sergeant. Men who trusted me to bring them home. I carry them because I cannot save them. I carry them because someone has to remember that they existed. The Navy commander stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension with the authority of her rank. Sergeant, I believe there has been a misunderstanding here. This man is my guest for today's ceremony. Holt turned to face her, confusion and irritation competing for dominance on his face. Your guest, ma'am. With respect, you arrived here alone. I processed your credentials myself. The commander met his gaze without flinching. I am claiming him as my guest now, Sergeant. Is there a problem with that? The question hung between them while the parade ground continued its preparations around them, while the presidential motorcade drew closer with every passing minute, while an old man in a faded uniform stood perfectly still and waited to learn whether 53 years of keeping a promise would end with him being dragged away in handcuffs. The names had never stopped speaking to him. In the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep refused to come, in the moments between heartbeats when the world went still, Ezra heard them. Marcus with his quick laugh and quicker reflexes. William humming gospel songs while he worked on the demolition charges. Derek's dry observations about the absurdity of their situation, delivered in a deadpan that made even the worst nights bearable. And Isaiah, always Isaiah, his voice cutting through the darkness with something that sounded like hope, even when hope had no business existing. The aftermath of that mission had unfolded in a series of closed doors and classified conversations. Ezra had been debriefed by men whose names he never learned, asked questions about intelligence gathered and enemy positions observed, never once asked how it felt to watch 4 men die in the span of 90 seconds. The bodies had been returned to their families with stories that bore no resemblance to the truth. Training accident, equipment malfunction, the kind of sanitized explanations that fit neatly into official records and left no room for the blood-soaked reality of what had actually happened. The offer had come 3 years later, delivered by a colonel in an office with no windows and no name on the door. Medal of Honor, Master Sergeant Whitmore, for your actions during the extraction, carrying Corporal Okonkwo 12 miles through hostile territory under continuous enemy contact. Exceptional valor above and beyond the call of duty. Ezra had listened to the words as if they were being spoken in a language he no longer understood. The colonel had slid a folder across the desk, documents that would need to be signed, arrangements that would need to be made for a ceremony that would take place in private, because the operation itself could never be acknowledged. Sir, with respect, I cannot accept this. The colonel's expression had not changed, but something shifted behind his eyes. The medal is not optional, Master Sergeant. Your actions have been reviewed and approved at the highest levels. My actions got 4 men killed. Ezra's voice had cracked on the word killed, the first time he had spoken it aloud since returning stateside. I led them into that ambush. I missed the signs. I was responsible for their lives, and I failed them. Every single one of them. The enemy set that ambush, not you. The colonel's tone carried the patience of a man who had delivered this speech before. You cannot control enemy action. You can only control your response. And your response was extraordinary. My response was carrying a dead man 12 miles because I could not accept that I had lost him too. Ezra had stood then, his body moving before his mind could stop it. That is not valor, sir. That is guilt. That is refusing to let go, because letting go would mean admitting that I failed. I will not accept a medal for that. I will not stand on a stage and let people call me a hero when 4 better men are in the ground because of decisions I made. The colonel had studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The offer will remain open, Master Sergeant. Some honors are not meant to be refused forever. Ezra had walked out of that office and never returned. He had finished his service, accepted his discharge, and disappeared into a civilian life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. He had married a woman named Catherine who understood without being told that there were places inside him she would never be allowed to visit. They had built something quiet together, something that almost felt like peace. And then Catherine had died in a car accident 14 years later, and Ezra had learned that grief could compound itself, that new loss could tear open old wounds until they all bled together into something that felt like drowning. He had started visiting the families then. Once a year, every year he made his rounds. Marcus Tran's parents in San Francisco, who welcomed him with tea and photographs and never asked why he kept coming. William Coldwater's sister in Oklahoma, who had inherited her brother's faith and spoke of him as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Derek Yazie's grandmother on the reservation in Arizona, who said nothing at all but held Ezra's hands in hers and let the silence speak for both of them. And Lucille, always Lucille. She had aged with a grace that made Ezra feel every year of his own decline. Her apartment had grown smaller as the neighborhood changed around it, but the photographs of Isaiah remained constant, covering every available surface until walking through her living room felt like moving through a shrine. She never asked Ezra why he came. She never demanded explanations or absolution. She simply welcomed him, fed him food he did not deserve, and spoke of her son as if keeping his memory alive was the most natural thing in the world. It was Lucille who had finally broken through the walls Ezra had spent decades constructing. 3 years ago, sitting in her living room while her breath grew shallow and her eyes grew distant, she had taken his hand with a grip that still carried surprising strength. "You have been punishing yourself since the day you walked into my apartment," she had said. 50 years of carrying guilt that was never yours to carry. Isaiah made his choice. He stepped in front of those bullets because that is who he was. That is the man I raised. You did not fail him, Ezra. You honored him. You carried him home when anyone else would have left him behind. I should have seen the ambush. The words had torn out of Ezra like a confession held too long. I should have been faster. I should have been better. You should have been God, is what you mean. Lucille's smile had been sad and knowing. You should have known things no human being could know. You should have stopped bullets with your bare hands. That is not how the world works, child. That is not how any of this works. She had died 2 weeks later, her hand still holding his, her final words of command that Ezra had carried ever since. When they tell the truth, you stand up. You let them see you. Promise me. He had promised. And now, standing on the parade ground where Isaiah had learned to be a soldier, facing a sergeant who saw nothing but a confused old man in a costume, Ezra understood that the moment Lucille had been preparing him for had finally arrived. 53 years of carrying the dead. 53 years of refusing recognition that felt like betrayal. But Lucille's voice still echoed in his memory, cutting through the doubt and the guilt and the endless weight of names that would never stop speaking. You let them see you. Ezra straightened his spine, feeling the old uniform shift against shoulders that had carried more than any human being should ever have to carry. The Navy commander was still standing between him and Holt, her intervention buying time that Ezra was not sure he deserved. But deserving had never been the point. The promise had been the point. And today, finally, he was going to keep it. Commander Adrian Walsh had not expected to witness history when she arrived at Fort Bragg that morning. She had been invited to the ceremony as a representative of naval intelligence, one of dozens of officers from various branches attending to honor a posthumous Medal of Honor recipient whose file had finally been declassified after 5 decades of official silence. It was supposed to be a routine appearance, a chance to pay respects and network with colleagues before returning to her desk at the Pentagon. Then she had seen the old man in the faded uniform, and routine had evaporated like morning fog under harsh sunlight. Walsh had spent 11 years in naval intelligence, the last 4 specializing in historical operations analysis. Her job involved reviewing declassified materials, connecting dots between missions that had been deliberately separated to prevent exactly the kind of pattern recognition she had been trained to perform. She had read files that would never see public release. She had studied operations that existed only as whispers in the memories of men who had been sworn to silence. And she had seen that face before. The photograph in the classified briefing had been grainy, a black and white image taken in 1968 showing a five-man special forces team preparing for insertion in a territory that American forces were never supposed to enter. The mission designation had been redacted, the operation name blacked out with the kind of thoroughness that suggested someone very high up wanted it forgotten. But the faces had been visible, and one of those faces had belonged to a young master sergeant with eyes that looked like they had already seen too much. Those same eyes were now staring past Sergeant Holt, fixed on something Walsh could not see, something that existed only in memory. The young man in the photograph had become old, his shoulders narrowed by time, his hands marked by the tremor of age. But the eyes had not changed. They still carried that weight, that impossible burden of knowledge that could never be shared. Walsh had pulled out her phone on instinct, some part of her recognizing that she was watching something significant unfold. But as Holt's confrontation escalated, as the tattoo on the old man's arm became visible in the morning light, Walsh had stopped recording. Her hands had begun to shake with a recognition that went beyond professional interest. The coordinates inked into that weathered skin matched a location she had seen in the classified files, a position in Laos where American forces had never officially operated, a place where, according to documents that still bore the stamp of national security classification, a reconnaissance team had been ambushed while gathering intelligence for a prisoner rescue operation. For men killed. One survivor. Mission officially erased from all public records. The survivor's name had been redacted in every document Walsh had ever accessed, but his call sign had not. Spectre, a ghost who had carried his dead radio operator 12 miles through enemy jungle rather than leave him behind. A legend in special forces circles, spoken of in hushed tones by instructors at training facilities who could not explain how they knew the story. A man who had refused the Medal of Honor because he believed he had failed the men who died under his command. Walsh had stepped forward without fully deciding to move, her voice cutting through Holt's escalating threats with an authority she was not entirely sure she possessed. Claiming the old man as her guest had been a gamble, a desperate improvisation designed to buy time, while her mind raced through the implications of what she was witnessing. Holt's confusion was evident, his eyes darting between Walsh and Ezra, as if trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. "Ma'am, I need to understand what is happening here. You've arrived alone. Your credentials were processed through standard channels. There was no mention of any guest." Walsh held his gaze without flinching. "Sergeant, I am exercising my prerogative as a field-grade officer to vouch for a veteran's presence at a ceremony honoring fallen servicemen. Is there a regulation that prevents me from doing so?" The question was calculated to put Holt on his heels, forcing him to search his mental database of protocols and procedures for something that would justify continued resistance. Walsh could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the frustration building as he failed to find the ammunition he needed. "Ma'am, this man has no credentials. He has no invitation. He is wearing a uniform that looks like it came from a museum and claiming awards that do not exist in any official database. With respect, I do not understand why you would stake your reputation on someone who is clearly not what he claims to be." Walsh felt the words forming before she could stop them, propelled by something that felt almost like anger. "Sergeant, have you ever considered that some things do not exist in official databases because they were deliberately removed? Have you ever considered that the absence of documentation might be evidence of classification rather than fabrication?" Holt's expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across his features before hardening into defensiveness. "Ma'am, I do not deal in conspiracy theories. I deal in protocols. And the protocol for a presidential visit is clear. No unauthorized personnel in restricted areas. No exceptions." The standoff held for a long moment, the parade ground continuing its preparations around them, while the two officers locked in a silent battle of wills. Behind them, the junior enlisted personnel had stopped pretending to work, their attention fixed on the confrontation with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. The young private with the red hair had moved closer, her eyes still fixed on Ezra with that look of troubled recognition. Ezra himself remained motionless, his hands folded in front of him, his breathing steady and controlled. He had not spoken since Walsh's intervention, had not attempted to defend himself or explain his presence. He simply stood there, patient as stone, waiting for forces beyond his control to determine whether 53 years of keeping a promise would end in vindication or humiliation. Walsh was acutely aware of the time. The presidential motorcade was less than 20 minutes out. Whatever happened next needed to happen quickly, or the decision would be made for all of them by the arrival of Secret Service protocols that would sweep aside everything else. "Sergeant," Walsh lowered her voice, pitching it for Holt's ears alone. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. I cannot explain how I know what I know. I cannot provide you with documentation or official verification. But I am asking you, as one service member to another, to trust me when I tell you that removing this man from this ceremony would be a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your career." Holt's jaw tightened. "That sounds like a threat, ma'am." "It is not a threat." Walsh's eyes held his with an intensity that made Holt want to look away. "It is a warning, because in about 15 minutes, someone is going to arrive at this ceremony who knows exactly who this man is. And when that happens, everyone who participated in trying to remove him is going to have to explain their actions to people who do not accept excuses." The words hung between them while somewhere in the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors began to grow louder, the advance elements of the presidential arrival making their approach. Holt's hand moved toward his radio, then stopped, his fingers hovering over the transmit button while his mind wrestled with a decision that suddenly felt far more consequential than he had anticipated. Holt's hand remained frozen over his radio while the helicopter rotors grew louder, their rhythm cutting through the morning air like a countdown he could not stop. The commander's words had planted something in his mind that felt uncomfortably like doubt, a seed of uncertainty that was already sending roots into the bedrock of his confidence. He had been so certain. The old man's uniform was outdated, his medals unverifiable, his story too convenient to be believed. Holt had processed hundreds of credentials for this ceremony, had turned away dozens of people who lacked proper authorization, had built his reputation on being the sergeant who let nothing slip through. And now a Navy commander was telling him that everything he thought he knew might be wrong. "Ma'am, I need something more than your word." Holt's voice had lost some of its theatrical edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. "If I let this man through, and he turns out to be exactly what I think he is, my career is over. You understand that?" Walsh nodded slowly. "I understand. And I am telling you that if you remove him and he turns out to be exactly what I think he is, your career is over in a way that makes the other scenario look like a promotion." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the figure approaching from the direction of the VIP parking area. He was older, mid-60s, wearing the kind of expensive civilian suit that suggested either private sector success or government authority. His walk carried the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform before transitioning to whatever role he currently occupied, and his eyes, as he drew closer, were fixed on the old man in the faded green uniform with an intensity that made Walsh's breath catch in her throat. The newcomer stopped at the edge of the confrontation, his gaze sweeping across the scene with the quick assessment of someone trained to process tactical situations. His attention lingered on Holt's aggressive posture, on the MPs standing uncertainly behind him, on Walsh's protective positioning near Ezra. And then his eyes locked onto the ribbons on Ezra's chest, and something shifted in his expression that looked almost like recognition. "Sergeant." The newcomer's voice carried an authority that made Holt straighten instinctively. "What exactly is happening here?" Holt's response came automatically, the words tumbling out in the clipped cadence of a subordinate reporting to a superior, even though the man wore no uniform and displayed no rank. "Sir, I am addressing a security concern. This individual lacks proper credentials for the restricted area and has been unable to provide satisfactory verification of his claimed military service." The newcomer's eyes had not left Ezra's chest. His claimed military service. He repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. And what service does he claim? Special Forces, sir. Vietnam era. Claims he served with the Medal of Honor recipient being honored today. The newcomer was silent for a long moment. His hand rose slowly to his own chest, touching a spot where a ribbon might once have rested, and Walsh saw his fingers tremble slightly before he forced them still. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. That ribbon, the one near the top of his arrangement. Do you know what it is, Sergeant? Holt's confidence faltered visibly. No, sir. I have never seen it in any official database. The newcomer nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the faded rectangle of color that had caused so much confusion. You would not have. It was created for a specific set of operations conducted between 1966 and 1972. Operations that were classified at the highest level and remained so until approximately 6 months ago. There are perhaps 40 men still living who are authorized to wear that ribbon. I know, because I helped compile the list when the declassification review began. The words landed in the space between them like stones dropped into still water. Walsh felt her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Holt's face had gone pale, his hand finally dropping away from his radio as if the device had suddenly become too heavy to touch. Sir, Holt's voice cracked slightly. Who are you? The newcomer finally turned to look at him directly. My name is Raymond Alcott. I serve as a captain in military assistance at Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. I now serve as a civilian advisor to the Joint Special Operations Command, specifically in matters relating to historical operations review. I was invited to today's ceremony because I helped process the declassification that made it possible. He turned back to Ezra, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded almost like reverence. And unless I am very much mistaken, I am standing in front of a man whose file I have read more times than I can count. A man whose actions I have used as a teaching example for 3 generations of special operations personnel. A man who has refused every attempt at recognition for 53 years because he believed he failed the men who died under his command. Ezra's eyes met Alcott's for the first time, and something passed between them that Walsh could not interpret. A recognition that went beyond names and faces, beyond shared experiences. The recognition of men who had walked through the same darkness and emerged carrying the same weight. Alcott's voice dropped lower still. Your call sign was Spectre. You led a 5-man reconnaissance team into Laos in March of 1968. You were ambushed on the 3rd day. 4 men died. You carried your radio operator 12 miles to extraction rather than leave him behind. And you have spent every day since then believing that their deaths were your fault. The parade ground had gone utterly silent around them. The junior enlisted had stopped even pretending to work, their preparations forgotten as they witnessed something they did not fully understand, but somehow knew was significant. The young private with the red hair had tears streaming down her face, though she could not have explained why. The MPs had stepped back, their hands falling away from their belts, as if the very idea of restraining the old man had become unthinkable. Holt stood frozen, his certainty collapsing around him like a structure built on sand. The old man he had mocked, the uniform he had called a costume, the medals he had dismissed as fabrications. Everything he thought he knew was reshaping itself into something that made his stomach turn with the dawning realization of what he had almost done. Ezra's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. You read my file. Alcott nodded. Every word, every commendation, every refusal of recognition. He paused, his own voice growing thick, including the recommendation that was submitted 3 years ago when the declassification review began. The recommendation that you finally be given the honor you have spent 53 years refusing. The helicopter rotors were directly overhead now, the presidential aircraft beginning its descent toward the landing zone. But no one in the small group gathered near the staging area was watching the sky. They were watching Ezra, watching the moment when 5 decades of secrets began finally, irreversibly, to crack open. The presidential helicopter touched down with a precision that spoke of countless rehearsals, its rotors sending waves of wind across the parade ground that rippled through the assembled flags and bunting. Secret Service agents emerged first, their eyes scanning the perimeter with the systematic intensity of men who trusted nothing and no one. Behind them, staff members and military aides descended in careful formation, each one moving to a predetermined position as if choreographed by an invisible hand. Ezra watched the arrival without moving, his body still locked in the same position he had held since Olcott's words had stripped away 5 decades of anonymity. The photograph in his breast pocket pressed against his heart with a weight that suddenly felt different, heavier and lighter at the same time, as if the truth emerging into daylight had changed its fundamental nature. Olcott had stepped closer, his voice pitched low enough that only Ezra could hear. "They're going to ask you to join the ceremony. On the platform, there is a second presentation today that was not included in the public announcements." Ezra's response came automatically, the refusal as familiar as breathing. "I told them no. 50 years ago. I cannot accept recognition for a mission that killed 4 men." Olcott's hand came to rest on Ezra's shoulder, the touch gentle but firm. "I know what you told them. I know why you told them. But I need you to understand something, Master Sergeant. This ceremony is not just about honoring Isaiah Okonkwo. It is about correcting a wrong that has persisted for over half a century. It is about acknowledging that the men who serve in operations that could not be spoken of still deserve to have their service recognized." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Recognizing me does not bring them back. It does not undo what happened. It does not change the fact that I led them into that ambush. No." Olcott's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades wrestling with the same questions. "It does not change any of that, but it might change what happens next. There are men and women serving right now in operations that will never be acknowledged, carrying burdens that will never be officially recognized. They need to know that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. They need to know that their service matters, even if it can never be spoken of. And right now, the only way to show them that is for men like you to step forward and let the world see what was hidden." The words hung between them while the presidential party continued its approach toward the staging area. Ezra could see the president now, surrounded by aides and security, moving with the careful efficiency of someone whose every moment was scheduled and scripted. In a matter of minutes, the ceremony would begin. In a matter of minutes, everything Ezra had spent 53 years avoiding would become unavoidable. He thought of Lucille, her hands gripping his in that small apartment, surrounded by photographs of a son who would never grow old. He thought of her final words, the command that had echoed through every day since her death. "You let them see you. Promise me." He thought of Isaiah, 22 years old and bleeding out in the jungle, his voice barely a whisper as he absolved Ezra of a guilt that would never fully release its grip. "Not your fault. Never your fault. You get home. You tell my mama I did good." He thought of Marcus and William and Derek, their faces frozen in memory at the ages they would never exceed, their voices silenced by an ambush that Ezra had replayed in his mind 10,000 times, searching for the mistake he must have made, the sign he must have missed. And he thought of the young men and women he had passed on his way onto the base that morning, soldiers in uniforms that looked nothing like the one he wore, carrying weapons and technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1968. They would deploy to places that might never be acknowledged. They would sacrifice in ways that might never be recognized. And someday, if they survived, they would carry the same weight that Ezra had carried for 53 years. Could he really let them believe that the weight would never be lifted? Could he really choose his own comfort over the message that stepping forward might send? Holt had not moved since Olcott's revelation, his face still carrying the ashen pallor of a man whose certainties had been demolished. The MPs behind him stood in uncertain attention, no longer threatening, but not quite sure what their role had become. Walsh watched from a few feet away, her expression holding something that looked almost like hope. The young private with the red hair had moved closer still, her tears dried, but her eyes fixed on Ezra with an intensity that demanded something he was not sure he could give. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, she had said, had come home with coordinates tattooed on his arm, and names he never explained, had died without ever speaking of what he had done or what it had cost him. Ezra understood in that moment that his choice was not just about himself. It had never been just about himself. Every veteran who had served in silence, every family who had mourned without understanding, every young soldier who would someday carry the same impossible burden, they were all connected to this moment. They were all waiting to see what Ezra would do. His hand moved to his breast pocket, fingers touching the photograph that had lived against his heart for 53 years. Two faces stared back at him from memory, young and unaware of what the next 72 hours would cost them. Isaiah's smile, his own eyes, not yet carrying the weight they would carry for the rest of his life. I made a promise. Ezra's voice emerged stronger than he expected, carrying across the small group with a clarity that silenced even the background noise of the ceremony preparations. I made a promise to a dying friend and to his mother. I told them that when the truth finally came out, I would be there. I would stand up and let the world see. He turned to face the platform where the president was now taking his position, where chairs had been arranged for dignitaries and family members, where a ceremony 53 years in the making was about to begin. I have been hiding from that promise for a long time. Ezra's eyes found Alcott's, then Walsh's, then finally Holt's. Hiding because I was afraid that accepting recognition would mean accepting that I had done something worthy of it. And I have never believed that. I have never believed that surviving when they died made me a hero. His spine straightened, the old uniform shifting against shoulders that seemed suddenly broader, more capable of bearing the weight they had carried for so long. But I made a promise, and today I'm going to keep it. The presidential advance team noticed them first. A woman in a dark suit with an earpiece coiled against her collar broke away from the main group and approached with the controlled urgency of someone trained to identify anomalies before they became problems. Her eyes swept across the scene, cataloging Holt's frozen posture, the MPs standing at uncertain attention, Walsh's protective stance, and Alcott's hand still resting on the shoulder of an old man in a uniform that belonged to another era. What was happening here? Her voice carried no question mark, only the flat demand of someone who needed answers immediately. Alcott stepped forward, his civilian suit somehow carrying more authority than any uniform on the parade ground. My name is Raymond Alcott. I am a civilian advisor to Joint Special Operations Command, cleared for today's ceremony. This man is Master Sergeant Ezra Whitmore, retired. He served with Corporal Okonkwo in 1968. He is the reason we are all here today. The advance team member's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition. She touched her earpiece, speaking in a voice too low to be overheard, her eyes never leaving Ezra's face. The response she received made her posture shift almost imperceptibly, tension releasing from her shoulders as she received confirmation of something she had apparently been told to expect. Master Sergeant Whitmore. Her tone had changed completely, the suspicion replaced by something that sounded almost like deference. The president has been hoping you would come. Please follow me. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Holt made a sound that might have been a protest dying in his throat. Walsh exhaled slowly, her suspicions confirmed in a way that left no room for doubt. The young private with the red hair pressed her hand against her mouth, tears threatening to return. Ezra did not move immediately. His eyes found Holt's across the space between them, and for a long moment the two men simply looked at each other. The sergeant who had mocked and threatened, the veteran who had endured in silence. The confrontation that had nearly ended in humiliation now transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. Sergeant, Ezra's voice was quiet but clear. You were doing your job. You saw what the evidence suggested and you acted accordingly. I do not hold that against you. Holt's mouth opened, but no words emerged. His face had progressed through several shades of pale and was now settling into something that looked almost green. The weight of what he had almost done, what he had said, the accusations he had hurled at a man who was now being personally summoned by the President of the United States, all of it pressed down on him with a force that made breathing difficult. The advance team member gestured toward the platform. Master Sergeant, if you would come with me. The ceremony will begin shortly, and the president would like to speak with you before it starts. Ezra nodded slowly and began to walk. His limp was more pronounced now, the old injury in his hip protesting after so long standing in one position, but his bearing had transformed in a way that made the limp seem almost irrelevant. The homeless old man in the costume had disappeared somewhere in the last few minutes. In his place walked someone else entirely. Someone whose shoulders remembered how to carry weight. Someone whose spine remembered how to hold itself straight. Someone whose eyes carried not just the burden of the past, but something that looked almost like purpose. Walsh fell in a step beside him without being asked. Her presence a silent declaration that she intended to see this through. Olcott walked on his other side, his hand no longer on Ezra's shoulder, but close enough to offer support if needed. Behind them, the young private had begun to follow before catching herself, her feet carrying her forward a few steps before protocol reasserted its grip and held her in place. The platform loomed ahead, its red, white, and blue bunting rippling in the wind generated by the now-silent helicopter rotors. Rows of white chairs faced the elevated stage, already filling with dignitaries and family members and officials whose presence testified to the significance of the occasion. At the front of the seating area, in a section marked with small flags, sat a young black man in his early 30s wearing a suit that fit him perfectly and an expression that mixed grief with anticipation. Isaiah's nephew, the sole surviving member of the Okonkwo family. The man who would accept the Medal of Honor on behalf of an uncle he had never met, whose sacrifice he had learned about only 6 months ago when the Declassification Review finally released the truth into the light. Ezra's step faltered when he saw him. The resemblance was not exact, but it was there, something in the shape of the jaw and the set of the shoulders that echoed across 53 years and connected past to present in a way that made Ezra's chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. The advance team member led them around the edge of the seating area toward a small tent that had been erected behind the platform, a staging area where participants could wait before being called forward. Inside, standing beside a table covered with documents and ceremonial items, stood the President of the United States. He was shorter than Ezra had expected, though photographs always distorted such things. His suit was impeccable, his posture presidential in a way that seemed both natural and carefully cultivated. But it was his eyes that caught Ezra's attention. They held none of the political calculation that cameras usually captured. Instead, they carried something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were meeting someone he had known for a long time through stories and files and secondhand accounts. Master Sergeant Whitmore. The president extended his hand, and Ezra took it automatically, muscle memory from decades of military protocol overriding the unreality of the moment. I have been reading about you for months. I have to admit, I was not sure you would come. Ezra's voice emerged steadier than he felt. I almost did not, sir. I have spent a long time believing I did not deserve to be here. The president nodded slowly, his grip firm but not aggressive, the handshake of someone who understood that this moment required patience rather than performance. I read about that too. Your refusal in 1971. Your reasons for it. He paused, his eyes holding Ezra's with an intensity that made looking away impossible. I want you to know that I disagree with those reasons. And I want you to know that today, if you will allow it, we're going to make something right that has been wrong for far too long. The sounds of the ceremony preparations filtered through the tent walls, the shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices as hundreds of people took their seats to witness history being made. And inside the tent, standing face to face with the most powerful man in the world, Ezra Whitmore felt something shift in his chest that might have been the first crack in a wall he had spent 53 years building. The ceremony began with the national anthem, voices rising across the parade ground in a sound that Ezra had heard thousands of times, but which now seemed to vibrate through his bones with a resonance he had never felt before. He stood at the edge of the platform, positioned where the advance team had placed him, watching the crowd settle into their seats while the music swelled and faded into silence. The president took his position at the podium, his voice carrying across the assembled witnesses with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to speaking words that would be remembered. He spoke of sacrifice and service, of men and women who gave everything for a nation that often could not acknowledge their contributions. He spoke of classified operations and silent warriors, of the debt owed to those who served in shadows that might never be illuminated. And then he spoke of Isaiah Okonkwo. Corporal Okonkwo was 22 years old when he deployed to Southeast Asia in January of 1968. The president's voice filled the parade ground, amplified by speakers that carried his words to every corner of the assembled crowd. He served as a radio operator with a Special Forces reconnaissance team conducting operations that, until 6 months ago, remained classified at the highest levels of national security. What I'm about to tell you could not be spoken publicly for over 50 years. Today, we finally tell the truth. The citation unfolded in precise military language, each word chosen for its accuracy rather than its poetry. A mission into territory where American forces were never supposed to operate. Intelligence gathering for a prisoner rescue operation that would later become one of the most famous raids of the war. An ambush on the third day. Enemy fire from concealed positions. For men killed in the initial contact. In one act of extraordinary valor that had been hidden from the world for more than half a century. Corporal Okonkwo, upon seeing his team leader targeted by enemy fire, deliberately placed himself between the threat and his commanding officer. The president's voice had grown quieter, forcing the crowd to lean forward to hear. He sustained multiple gunshot wounds that would prove fatal. But his action saved the life of Master Sergeant Ezra Whitmore, who would subsequently carry Corporal Okonkwo 12 miles through hostile territory to the extraction point rather than leave his body behind. A sound moved through the crowd, something between a gasp and a murmur, the collective intake of breath from hundreds of people hearing for the first time what had been hidden for so long. In the front row, Isaiah's nephew had gone completely still, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if anchoring himself against a wind that threatened to sweep him away. The president continued, his voice steady despite the weight of the words he was delivering. Corporal Okonkwo's sacrifice was never recognized because the mission itself could not be acknowledged. His family was told he died in a training accident. His heroism was buried in classified files that were never meant to see daylight. Until now, he paused, letting the silence stretch across the parade ground before continuing. It is my profound honor, on behalf of a grateful nation, to award the Medal of Honor posthumously to Corporal Isaiah Okonkwo for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Isaiah's nephew rose from his seat and walked toward the platform on legs that did not seem entirely under his control. His face was wet with tears he had not bothered to wipe away, his eyes fixed on the medal that the president held in both hands as if it were something fragile and precious and infinitely heavy. The presentation itself took only moments. The medal placed into hands that trembled with the weight of 53 years of hidden truth. Words spoken too quietly for the microphones to capture. An embrace between a president and a young man who had just received confirmation that his uncle had been a hero in ways his family had never been allowed to know. And then Isaiah's nephew turned away from the podium, the medal clutched against his chest, and his eyes found Ezra standing at the edge of the platform. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across time. The nephew who had never met his uncle. The man who had carried that uncle 12 miles through the jungle rather than leave him to die alone. Two strangers connected by a sacrifice that had shaped both their lives in ways neither of them fully understood. Isaiah's nephew walked toward Ezra with steps that grew more certain as he approached. When he reached the old man in the faded uniform, he stopped, his eyes searching Ezra's face for something that words could not express. "My grandmother used to talk about you." His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hush that had fallen over the crowd, it carried. She said an angel watched over my uncle's memory. She said that angel came to visit her every year, never explaining who he was, just asking about her son. I never believed her. Until today. Ezra's composure, which had held through everything else, finally cracked. The tears he had refused to shed for 53 years spilled down his weathered cheeks as he looked at the young man who carried so much of Isaiah in the shape of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. Your uncle saved my life. Ezra's voice broke on the words. He stepped in front of bullets that were meant for me. I have spent every day since then wishing I could trade places with him. Isaiah's nephew shook his head slowly, the metal still pressed against his heart. My grandmother said you would say that. She said to tell you, if I ever found you, that Isaiah made his choice, and that you honored that choice by carrying him home. The embrace came without warning, the young man's arms wrapping around Ezra with a force that spoke of decades of unanswered questions finally finding their resolution. Ezra's hands came up slowly, hesitantly, as if he had forgotten how to accept comfort. And then he was holding onto Isaiah's nephew like a drowning man gripping a lifeline, his body shaking with sobs that had been locked away for longer than this young man had been alive. The crowd watched in silence as two strangers held each other on the platform, connected by a sacrifice that had finally been brought into the light. And somewhere in the back of the assembly, Sergeant First Class Holt stood with tears streaming down his own face, watching the man he had called a fraud receive the embrace he had earned 53 years ago. The president allowed the moment to breathe, letting the embrace between Ezra and Isaiah's nephew continue until they separated naturally. Two men who had been strangers minutes ago, now bound by something that transcended introduction. Only when they stepped apart did he return to the podium, his voice carrying a different quality now, something more personal than presidential. What you have just witnessed is the correction of one injustice that has persisted for 53 years. The president's eyes found Ezra across the platform. But there is another injustice that must be addressed today, one that has waited even longer for resolution. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Isaiah's nephew turned to look at Ezra with an expression of dawning understanding. On the platform, Walsh gripped Alcott's arm, her suspicions about the second presentation now confirmed. In 1971, the United States Army recommended Master Sergeant Ezra Whitmore for the Medal of Honor for his actions during the mission in which Corporal Okonkwo lost his life. The president's voice filled the silence that had fallen over the parade ground. Specifically, for carrying his mortally wounded radio operator 12 miles through enemy-controlled territory under continuous hostile contact, refusing to abandon his fallen comrade, even when extraction assets advised him to leave the body behind. Ezra's legs felt suddenly uncertain beneath him. He had known this was coming, had understood from the moment the advance team member spoke his name what this ceremony truly meant. But hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing his actions described in the formal language of military commendation, made it real in a way that thinking about it never had. Master Sergeant Whitmore refused that medal. The president continued, his tone carrying something that sounded almost like admiration. He refused it because he believed he had failed, because 4 men under his command died that day. And in his mind, no act of valor could outweigh that loss. For 53 years, he has carried the weight of that refusal along with the weight of the men he could not save. The crowd had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Ezra, standing at the edge of the platform in his faded uniform, his cheeks still wet with tears, his hands trembling at his sides. I have read Master Sergeant Whitmore's file extensively in preparation for today. The president's voice softened. I have read his reasons for refusing recognition. I have read the arguments he made to the officers who tried to convince him to accept. And I have to tell you, as someone who has studied leadership and sacrifice for most of my adult life, I have never encountered a more profound misunderstanding of what heroism actually means. He stepped away from the podium, moving toward Ezra with deliberate steps that closed the distance between them. Heroism is not the absence of loss. The president's words were quiet now, meant for Ezra, but amplified by the microphone clipped to his lapel. Heroism is not bringing everyone home safely. If that were the standard, there would be no heroes at all, because war does not allow for such outcomes. Heroism is doing what must be done when everything has gone wrong. Heroism is refusing to abandon your brother, even when every rational calculation says you should. Heroism is carrying the dead 12 miles through enemy territory, because leaving them behind would mean leaving behind everything you believe in. Ezra's breath came in shallow gasps. The wall he had built over 53 years, the fortress of guilt and self-recrimination that had protected him from feeling worthy of anything, was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. Master Sergeant Whitmore, the medal you refused in 1971 has remained in a classified file, waiting. The president reached into his jacket and withdrew a small blue box that seemed to carry more weight than its size should allow, waiting for the day when the truth could be told, waiting for the man who earned it to finally understand that earning it and deserving it are the same thing. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of white satin, lay the Medal of Honor, the pale blue ribbon, the gold star suspended from an eagle, the weight of a nation's gratitude compressed into metal and fabric and history. This medal belongs to you. The president lifted it from the box with both hands. Not because you succeeded in saving everyone, not because you made no mistakes, but because when everything fell apart, when 4 men lay dead and extraction was 12 miles away, you made a choice. You chose to carry your brother home. And that choice, Master Sergeant Whitmore, is the definition of valor. The president stepped forward and placed the ribbon around Ezra's neck. The medal came to rest against his chest, just above the photograph that had lived there for 53 years, and for a moment the weight of it seemed to press down with the accumulated mass of every year he had spent believing he did not deserve to wear it. And then something shifted. The weight did not disappear, but it transformed. It became something he could carry instead of something that carried him. It became recognition instead of accusation. It became truth instead of lie. For Isaiah, Ezra's voice emerged as barely a whisper, but the microphones caught it and carried it across the silent crowd. For Marcus, for William, for Derek, for all of them. The president nodded slowly, his own eyes glistening in the morning light. For all of them. Behind Ezra, Isaiah's nephew had moved forward again. He stood just off the old man's shoulder, close enough to touch. The medal his uncle had earned still clutched against his chest. 2 medals. 2 men connected by sacrifice. 2 pieces of story that had finally been told. The crowd rose to their feet, not in response to any command or cue, but in the spontaneous recognition that they were witnessing something that transcended ceremony. Officers and enlisted, dignitaries and family members, young soldiers and old veterans, all of them standing in tribute to a man who had waited 53 years to stop running from the truth. And at the edge of the platform, his face transformed by an emotion he could not name, Sergeant First Class Holt rose with him. His hand came up slowly, trembling, and found its way to his brow in a salute that he held with every ounce of precision his training had given him. The old man in the costume, the fraud in the outdated uniform, the gatecrasher he had threatened to arrest. Holt held the salute until his arm ached, tears cutting tracks down his cheeks, bearing witness to the moment when everything he thought he knew about judgment and appearance and worth revealed itself to be nothing more than blindness wearing the mask of certainty. The ceremony concluded with a 21-gun salute that echoed across the parade ground like thunder rolling through a clear sky. Each shot seemed to punctuate something final, a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 53 years to complete. When the last report faded into silence, the crowd began to move, dignitaries seeking photographs, family members embracing, journalists positioning themselves for interviews that would carry this story to every corner of the country. Ezra stood at the center of it all, the medal hanging against his chest with a weight that still felt foreign but no longer felt wrong. People approached in waves, hands extended, voices offering congratulations and gratitude, and the kind of reverent respect that made him want to look over his shoulder to see who they were really addressing. He accepted each greeting with the quiet grace that had carried him through the confrontation with Holt, through the revelation of his identity, through the moment when the president placed around his neck the recognition he had spent half a century refusing. Isaiah's nephew remained at his side, a constant presence that anchored Ezra to the present moment when the past threatened to pull him under. His name was Jerome, Ezra learned. Jerome Okonkwo, named for an uncle he had never met, raised on stories of a hero whose heroism could never be explained. He was a teacher, he said. High school history. The irony of that was not lost on either of them. My grandmother kept a photograph of you on her mantle. Jerome's voice was steady now. The initial flood of emotion settled into something quieter and more sustainable. She never told me who you were, just that you were someone who mattered, someone who had loved her son. She was an extraordinary woman. Ezra's hand found the photograph in his breast pocket, touching it through the fabric as he had done 10,000 times before. She forgave me for things I could never forgive myself. She would have been proud today. Jerome looked at the medal hanging against Ezra's chest. Proud that you finally let them see you. The words hit Ezra with the force of a physical blow. Lucille's voice, echoing through her nephew's mouth, reaching across the years in the grave to remind him that the promise he had made was only half fulfilled by showing up. The other half required accepting what was offered, letting the truth stand without argument. The crowd continued to flow around them, but a space had cleared near the edge of the platform where a single figure stood apart from the celebration. Sergeant First Class Holt had not moved since the ceremony ended. His salute had long since dropped, but his posture remained rigid, locked in place by something that looked like paralysis of the spirit. Ezra excused himself from Jerome and walked toward the man who had tried to remove him from the ceremony less than 2 hours ago. Each step felt deliberate, necessary, part of a closing that needed to happen before anything else could begin. Holt saw him coming and flinched visibly, his body tensing as if preparing for a blow he knew he deserved. His mouth opened and closed several times before words finally emerged. Master Sergeant, I do not know what to say. His voice cracked on the words. I called your medals fake. I called your uniform a costume. I threatened to have you arrested. I stood there and accused you of stolen valor while you were wearing the Medal of Honor that you earned carrying your brother through 12 miles of jungle. Ezra stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give Holt room to breathe. You saw an old man in an outdated uniform claiming things you could not verify. You responded based on what the evidence suggested. I told you before that I do not hold that against you. You should. Holt's composure broke, tears spilling down his cheeks for the second time that morning. God, you should. I have spent my entire career believing I could spot the fakes, the phonies, the people who wear service they did not earn. I was so certain, so absolutely certain that I knew what I was looking at. Certainty is a dangerous thing. Ezra's voice carried the weight of someone who had learned that lesson in ways Holt could not imagine. It makes us blind to everything that does not fit the picture we have already constructed. I have been certain of things too. I was certain for 53 years that I did not deserve recognition for that mission. I was wrong. Holt shook his head slowly, unable to accept the absolution being offered. How can you be so calm about this? I humiliated you. I did it publicly, deliberately, in front of everyone. If that video had not been stopped, if the commander had not intervened, I would have dragged you off this base in handcuffs while the president was preparing to give you the Medal of Honor. Ezra considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. Because I understand what drove you. You wanted to protect something you believe in. You wanted to make sure that the people who actually served are not diminished by those who claim service falsely. That impulse is not wrong. The execution was flawed, but the intention was not. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. And because I know what it feels like to be trapped by your own certainty. To be so convinced that you have failed that you cannot see any other possibility. I spent 53 years in that prison. I would not wish it on anyone else. Holt stared at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. How do you get out? How do you escape that kind of certainty once it has hold of you? Ezra reached up and touched the medal hanging against his chest, feeling the weight of it alongside the weight of the photograph that had lived in that pocket for half a century. You let someone show you a different truth, and then you have the courage to accept it, The two men stood in silence while the celebration continued around them. Finally, Holt straightened his spine and brought his hand up in a salute that held none of the trembling of his earlier effort. This one was crisp, precise, the salute of one soldier honoring another. Master Sergeant Whitmore, thank you for your service. And thank you for your grace. Ezra returned the salute with a formality that felt both ancient and appropriate. Sergeant Holt, thank you for your vigilance. Never stop protecting what matters. Just remember that what matters is not always obvious. He dropped his hand and turned away, walking back toward Jerome and the crowd of well-wishers who waited with their congratulations and their questions and their hunger to be part of a story that had finally been told. Behind him, Holt remained at attention for several seconds longer, processing an encounter that had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of judgment, appearance, and the cost of being wrong. 3 months had passed since the ceremony at Fort Bragg. The autumn leaves had fallen and been replaced by the first frost of winter, transforming the Chicago cemetery into a landscape of white and gray that seemed to mute everything except the sound of Ezra's footsteps on the frozen path. He walked differently now. The limp remained, would always remain, but something in his bearing had shifted in ways that observers struggled to articulate. He carried himself like a man who had set down a weight he had been holding for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The headstone emerged from the frost like an old friend waiting. Lucille May Okonkwo, beloved mother, 1924 to 2023. Beside her, a newer stone marked the symbolic resting place of her son, though Isaiah's body had been returned to American soil decades ago and laid to rest in a military cemetery in Virginia. This marker was for the family, for the neighborhood, for the community that had known the Okonkwos and deserved a place to remember. Ezra lowered himself to the frozen ground beside the stones, his joints protesting in the way that 78 years of hard living had taught them to protest. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew 2 items. The photograph, worn soft at the edges, still showing 2 young faces that would never grow old together, and a small velvet box containing a medal that had waited 53 years to find its way home. I did it, Lucille. He spoke aloud, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. I let them see me. Just like you said, the silence that answered held no judgment, no expectation, only the patient presence of memory. I should have done it sooner. I should have listened to you years ago. But I was so certain that accepting recognition would be betraying them somehow. Betraying Isaiah and Marcus and William and Derek. I thought that carrying the guilt was the only way to honor what they gave. He placed the photograph against Lucille's headstone, leaning it carefully so the 2 young faces looked out at the winter sky. Your grandson found me, you know. Jerome, he was at the ceremony. He told me you kept a photograph of me on your mantle all those years and never explained who I was. He said you call me an angel. Ezra's voice broke slightly on the word. I was never an angel, Lucille. I was just a man who could not let go. The cemetery stretched around him in frozen silence, rows of stones marking lives completed and stories ended. But Ezra no longer felt like a visitor from the land of the dead. For the first time in 53 years, he felt like someone who was still living, still capable of writing chapters that had not yet been written. The changes had begun almost immediately after the ceremony. Jerome had insisted that Ezra come to Chicago, had refused to accept any argument about not wanting to impose or not deserving hospitality. The spare bedroom in Jerome's apartment had become Ezra's room, filled gradually with the few possessions he had accumulated during decades of deliberate rootlessness. A place to sleep that was not a shelter or a motel or the backseat of a car. A place that felt impossibly like it might become home. The work had followed the housing. Commander Walsh had connected Ezra with a veterans organization in Chicago that focused on reaching those who had fallen through the cracks of traditional support systems. Men and women who had served in operations that could not be discussed, who carried trauma that could not be explained to counselors without security clearances, who had spent years believing that their silence meant their suffering did not matter. Ezra had started by listening, sitting in basement meeting rooms with other ghosts, hearing stories that echoed his own in ways that made the walls between them dissolve. And then, slowly, he had started talking, telling his own story, explaining what 53 years of refusing help had cost him and what finally accepting it had given him back. The video from the ceremony had spread across the internet in ways that Ezra still did not fully understand. Millions of views, comments from veterans and families and strangers who had been moved by the image of an old man in a faded uniform receiving recognition he had spent half a century refusing. Messages had poured in from people asking how they could help their own fathers, their own grandfathers, their own brothers who carried similar weights in similar silence. Ezra could not answer all of them, but he could answer some. And each conversation, each connection, each moment when someone who had been hiding finally stepped into the light felt like a small repayment of a debt he had owed for longer than he could remember. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that recognition delayed is not recognition denied, and that the heroes among us often wear faces we would never expect, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves to be seen? Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who have been waiting longest to set down their burdens. Thank you for watching. Ezra rose slowly from the frozen ground, his hand touching both headstones in a gesture of farewell that was also a gesture of promise. He would return. He would always return. But the returns would be different now. They would be visits rather than pilgrimages, conversations rather than confessions. The relationship between the living and the dead, transformed by the simple act of finally allowing himself to be counted among the former. The walk back to Jerome's car took longer than it should have, but Ezra did not mind. The cold air felt clean in his lungs, and the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow that made the world look new. Jerome waited with the engine running and the heat on, a thermos of coffee ready, the easy patience of a man who had learned not to rush moments that needed their own time. "How are you feeling?" Jerome asked as Ezra settled into the passenger seat. Ezra considered the question as the car pulled away from the cemetery, leaving the stones and the memories behind, but carrying something else forward. He thought about the medal in his pocket, finally accepted. He thought about the photograph that would always live against his heart. He thought about Lucille and Isaiah and the 4 men whose names he would carry until his own name was carved into stone. "I am feeling like I am still here." Ezra's voice was steady, certain in a way that no longer felt like a prison. "Still trying. And for the first time in 53 years, that feels like enough." The car merged onto the highway, heading toward the city, toward the apartment that had become home, toward a future that Ezra had spent decades believing he did not deserve to see. Behind them, the cemetery faded into the distance. But the dead did not feel abandoned. They felt at last like they were resting. And the man who had carried them for so long finally understood that putting them down did not mean letting them go. It meant honoring them by living. It meant keeping the promise not just by remembering, but by becoming someone worth remembering himself. Still here, brothers. Still here.